Reserving the right to object.
The senator from Iowa.
I've always advocated due respect for federal courts. And particularly over the last few years, I've opposed a vicious smear campaign by Democrats designed to undermine faith in our Supreme Court and our judicial system. Now that we have a Republican president, my Democrat colleagues appear to have newfound respect for the courts. It wasn't very long ago that they were singing a different time and a different tune. In the last few years, Democrats have called the Supreme Court, quote, controlled by creepy right-wing billionaires, a radical Supreme Court, and a partisan and reactionary court, end of quote. One of my colleagues on the Judiciary Committee said, quote, the idea that you can trust a Supreme Court has been blown to smithereens, end of quote. Another committee colleague declared, quote, I oppose these justices, end of quote. And yet another committee colleague questioned, quote, how can they call it an honorable court? The far-right justices are cherry-picking their way through constitutional text and history to impose their own ideological agenda on the American people, end of quote. Over the last few years, Democrats have repeatedly threatened the court for ruling in ways that they did not like. Famously, in 2020, the Senate Democratic leaders threatened the court to influence its rulings on abortion. He said, quote, I want to tell you, Gorsuch, I want to tell you, Kavanaugh, you have released the whirlwinds, and you will pay the price. You won't know what hit you if you go forward with these awful decisions, end quote. And in the wake of the 2024 presidential immunity decision, Democratic House minority leaders said, quote, House Democrats will engage in aggressive oversight and legislative activity with respect to the Supreme Court to ensure that the extreme far-right justices in the majority are brought into compliance with the Constitution, end of quote. Now, I'm happy that Democrats have finally discovered the importance of respecting the judiciary. They certainly didn't hold this view when President Biden was in office. President Biden ignored the court's position that the CDC's eviction moratorium was unconstitutional, and his own lawyer's advice that he couldn't do it. He went ahead and extended the moratorium anyway, and the court had to strike it down. President Biden boasted once that the court's decision on student loan forgiveness, quote, didn't stop him, end quote. The Biden administration undermined the court's 2023 decision that racial discrimination in college admissions is unconstitutional, and even issued a Dear Colleague letter on how to circumvent that ruling. More broadly, President Biden flouted law after law throughout his entire administration. He ignored the plain text of our immigration laws, the parole statute, our civil rights laws in the name of advancing his agenda. And you know what? I heard no complaint from my Democrat colleagues. Although I fully agree that Congress stands for the rule of law, this resolution is nothing but a partisan messaging statement. President Trump has been clear on this. Just a few weeks ago, he said, quote, I'll always abide by the courts, and then I'll have to appeal. The answer is, I always abide by the courts, end of quote. There have been numerous extreme orders from various district courts improperly encroaching on core Article 2 of powers. President Trump and his administration have worked diligently to abide by those orders, no matter how outrageous, by appealing them and challenging their scope and reach. He's completely within his right to do so, and his conduct is appropriate and legitimate. Our constitutional system has a robust system of checks and balances. The executive branch must abide by the courts, and the courts must also ensure that their rulings are respectful of jurisdictional limits, and particularly our famous separation of powers. Some of the recent orders of individual district judges issued on an expedited basis with very broad nationwide impact have concerned me. I think Congress needs to examine this issue closely. Concerns about nationwide injunctions, temporary restraining orders have been raised on both sides of the aisle across presidential administrations. And if my colleagues want to work with me on it, we will head down that route of addressing those abuses. For today's purposes, however, this resolution is incomplete. And coming from Democrats, I think it shows that they're totally inconsistent. It unfairly targets President Trump. In turn, then, it ignores the Democratic attacks on the legitimacy of the court, and it ignores President Biden's flagrant violation of law. So, I am offering Senator Durbin an opportunity that he can't turn down, a resolution to highlight the inappropriate attacks by Democrats against the legitimacy of the Supreme Court, and to clarify the executive branch must comply with lawful orders.